Mr. Brown, you are sworn. The judge's low, authoritative voice rumbled through the hushed courtroom, each syllable ringing off the fine wooden walls like a finding already made. The atmosphere was tense, weighed down by expectation and judgment. Banks of onlookers packed the gallery, their gazes locked on the figure at its center, Kody Brown. Once famous for sermonizing on love, family, and harmony on American television screens, he now sat under the cold eye of the law, a defendant charged with violating the very institution he had once attempted to work within. The flash and click of cameras stopped the quiet, each jerk of his jaw, each anxious look. This wasn't a reality show family gathering. This was a court of law, and the stakes were much higher than anyone in their living rooms at home could possibly think. At risk was his freedom, his religion, and the very underpinnings of the life he had established. If the court decision were to go against him, Kody might lose everything: his reputation, his possessions, and even the ability to live the lifestyle he felt was God-ordained. And as the bailiff read the charges, it was apparent that this was no longer about polygamy. It was about power, money, lying, and where belief stopped and law began. Kody's heart beat so hard he could hear it, almost louder than the judge speaking. Years of swagger, the bravado he had shown in front of cameras, the sermons on plural marriage, the conviction that his family's way of life was safeguarded, all of it was starting to crumble under the harsh glare of the courtroom. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking to his left where his lawyers sat, their faces stern, their stacks of notes high. To his left stood the women who had shared his life: Meri, Janelle, Christine, and Robyn, each one representing a different page in his history. Meri, the first wife, sat rigid and emotionless, her eyes staring straight ahead as though retreating through all the choices that had gotten them to this point. Janelle held a large folder of financial papers, her analytical mind attempting to figure out every possible path. Christine's jaw was clenched, her fury barely leashed, fury at the state, at the system, and even perhaps at Kody himself. And Robyn, youngest and most devoted of the wives, her hands shaking as she mouthed prayers to herself. The prosecutor stood, her presence cutting and authoritative, and started reading the charges herself: bigamy, unlawful cohabitation, misrepresentation of marital status, and possible financial concealment. Each charge hit like a sledgehammer, eliciting audible gasps from the gallery. The phrase potential fraud hung in the air longer than the rest, a chilling reminder that this was no longer a straightforward constitutional debate over religious freedom. The state wasn't just accusing Kody of living a lifestyle outside the norm. They were accusing him of using that lifestyle as a cover for deeper, more calculated actions. If found guilty, the consequences could include hefty fines, property seizures, and even jail time. Kody's mind raced. Was this how it all ended? After decades of sermonizing on choice and love, would his be a cautionary tale in a law book? Reporters wrote furiously in their notebooks, several of them already writing the headlines that would soon overwhelm the internet before day's end. Reality TV star in prison danger over polygamy scandal. Kody Brown's empire in the dock. The circus was inescapable. What began as a television show about family and religion had become a genuine courtroom drama, and the world couldn't turn away. But below the media sensation, something more profound was at risk, something that cut to the heart of the American legal system. Could a man be held accountable for obeying his religion when it conflicted with state law? And if so, where was the line between personal faith and criminal action? The court was called to order by the judge, and opening arguments commenced. The prosecution sketched a damning portrait: a man who had not only decided to challenge the law, but had broadcast that challenge openly, made it a brand. This isn't about love, the prosecutor asserted, her voice cutting through tension. This is not about a man who constructed an empire on a foundation of illegality, who used the system, muddied the waters of legality, and declared himself above the law. She walked slowly in front of the jury, her gaze finding each juror individually. This is not about religion. This is about accountability. Kody's lawyer stood up next, and the tone became a little different. He used his voice softly, slowly asking the jurors to exercise their sense of fairness and freedom. This is not a case of crime, he contended. It is one of freedom. Freedom to believe, live and love as one wishes. My client never forged a marriage certificate. He never had more than one legal spouse. He simply opted to live his religion, openly and honestly. The defense portrayed Kody not as a criminal, but as a man persecuted because of his faith. A father who had raised children, built a family and served his community, now being prosecuted for the way he chose to love. Kody heard every word, his heart fluctuating between hope and despair. He recalled the beginnings, when he and Meri had first made the commitment to a plural life, so certain they were being called to something greater. He recalled the kids, a dozen or more of them, racing through their shared houses, the Maelstrom family meals, the non-stop debates over spirituality and obligation. He had always assumed that as long as they told the truth, as long as they weren't harming anybody, they would be all right. But the state had another view of things. To them, his calling wasn't a calling, it was a crime. As the day of testimony drew toward its close, the courtroom hung heavy with tension. Each look, each hushed word, each crumple of paper was loaded with a tale much greater than the man who stood at its hub. Kody had an inkling the coming days would be harsh. Cross-examination, accounting books, allegations that would bring his family's most intimate moments under public examination. But he also had one certainty: this trial was about more than him. It was about each family who ever had the courage to live outside the norm. It was about the right to create one's own definition of love, even if the law did not agree. And as the gavel finally came down to end the session, Kody breathed a sigh and whispered to himself, we fight to the end." The courtroom light bulbs burned more intensely on the second day, as if walls themselves were bent on revealing all secrets Kody Brown had ever attempted to conceal. The dour, procedural tone of the first day was gone. Today the prosecution arrived with fire. The chief prosecutor, a keen-eyed woman in her late 30s, with a reputation for taking apart celebrated defendants, walked confidently to the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen," she started, her voice cutting through the hush like a knife. "This case is not about religion. It's not about liberty. It's about deception, cheating, and a man who thinks he is above the law." Each word weighed like an anvil in the air, weighed and crushing. Kody shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd steeled himself for religious debates, for arguments regarding privacy, lifestyle, and choices. But what the prosecution was now constructing was a threat much more sinister. They were constructing a portrait of a man who had knowingly crossed legal boundaries, concealed truths, and manipulated the system for personal gain. The attorney gestured to a massive screen behind her, where photos, documents, and clips from the family's reality show flickered to life. "For over a decade," she said, pacing before the jury, "Mr. Brown has stood in front of cameras and informed America that he's married to 4 women. Not 1, 4. He's introduced them as wives. He's spoken of their children as one family, and he's made financial decisions that treat these women as legal spouses, all while insisting that this is a matter of faith." On the screen, Kody's own words replayed like evidence from a confession. In one clip, he boasted defiantly, "I have 4 wives and they're all equal." In another, he stated, "We built this life together. Every property, every dollar, every child, as one family." The prosecutor stopped the video and faced the jury. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is not spiritual belief. That is representation. And under Utah law, representation matters." Across the aisle, Kody's defense attorney protested, but the judge overruled. The prosecution moved on, now presenting financial documents that indicated Kody's signature on joint mortgage applications with several wives, co-signed automobile loans, and joint business accounts that had all 4 women as partners. He cannot assert these marriages are symbolic when he has constructed a whole financial edifice on their legal gravity, the prosecutor continued, brandishing one fat folder after another. "These are not prayers. They are contracts. They were evidence that Mr. Brown and his so-called spiritual wives conducted themselves as if their marriages were valid under the law." The jurors were leaning forward, some taking notes, others shaking their heads. The evidence was mounting quickly, and the state's argument was hitting home. Kody's gaze flicked to his wives sitting behind him. Meri sat stiff and inscrutable, and Janelle furiously writing on a pad of paper, probably running through the implications of each exhibit. Christine gripped her fists in her lap, anger at the condition emanating in silence. But Robyn appeared to be on the verge of tears, her mouth moving softly in silent prayer. Each of them was aware that the more deeply the prosecution dug, the more their well-ordered world started to resemble a legal house of cards. What they had always framed as a matter of faith, a deeply spiritual personal arrangement, was now being presented as an attempt to hoodwink the law. The prosecution's second witness was a state investigator, a soft-spoken, deliberate man who had spent months digging through the Brown family's finances and public records. As each bit of evidence he offered was presented, the narrative was becoming increasingly difficult for the defense to spin. He presented property deeds with several wives as joint tenants, insurance policies in their names as spouses, and tax returns suggesting domestic arrangements more complicated than a single legal marriage should permit. "It is our finding," said the investigator unequivocally, "that Mr. Brown deliberately set up his life to simulate a multi-spouse home in the eyes of the law, while simultaneously claiming protection under the banner of religious freedom." The defense cross-examined forcefully, contending that not a single document expressly stated more than a single legal marriage. "My client is lawfully wedded to just one woman, Robyn," the lawyer reminded the court. "The others are consenting adults cohabiting in a household. Are we now criminalizing cohabitation?" The prosecutor fired back in turn, without hesitation. "If this was just cohabitation, we would not be seeing joint mortgage deals, business partnerships, or public proclamations of marriage. This isn't four roommates sharing rent. This is a man staging a lifestyle intended to simulate several legal marriages, and profiting from it." The prosecution at one stage referred to the reality TV contracts of the family, noting how their plural marriage was both an idea and a brand. "Brown's family has made millions presenting themselves as a polygamist family," the prosecutor continued, displaying contracts with Kody's own signature. "He has benefited from the same lifestyle he now asserts is strictly private. He has made a business of suspected criminal activity." The term criminal activity resonated throughout the courtroom, and Kody felt his heart drop. It was no longer a question about beliefs. It was a question about intent, about money, about motive. The prosecutors wrapped up their case by looking back at the jury with one last strong remark. "The defendant has lived two lives," she told them, her voice low but firm. "One he shows to the government, one legal marriage. That's all. And another one he shows to the world. 4 wives, 1 family, 1 empire. That is not faith. That is dishonesty. And dishonesty under the law has repercussions." With that, she resumed her seat, leaving a stunned hush in her wake. The judge ordered a recess, and the courtroom broke into murmured discussions. Reporters dashed out to file reports. Activists on both sides argued in the corridors. And at the defense table, Kody was stiff. Every fiber in his being was crying out to rise up and defend himself, to tell them that this wasn't a matter of lying but of love, of faith, of family. But deep inside he knew that love wasn't in jeopardy here. He was. And the prosecutor had just made his life story Exhibit A. As he turned back to face his wives, their gazes met his, a blend of fear, anger, and defiance. This was more than the straightforward battle they had gotten themselves into. The state was not only targeting their religion, they were undermining their credibility, brick by brick. And if the defense could not find some way to counter it soon, the jury might not only regard them as a family in jeopardy, they might regard them as criminals using scripture as a cover. And that was a fight even Kody Brown wasn't certain he could win. When the defense finally had their turn, the tension in the courtroom changed. Gone was the strident, unyielding voice of the prosecution. Now a quieter, more even beat dominated as Kody Brown's lawyer stood up from his chair and tugged at his tie. He was an experienced constitutional attorney, accustomed to defending unpopular causes, and he addressed the jury not in inflammatory rhetoric, but in quiet, deliberate conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his tone warm but authoritative. "What you see before you today is not a trial for crime. It is a trial for belief. It is for whether or not the government can reach into someone's home, tell them how to live, and criminalize love because it doesn't fit in with what we think of as traditional. The eyes of the jury stayed on him. They had just been subjected to hours of testimony portraying Kody as a law manipulator. But suddenly the defense was attempting to recreate the whole picture, from one of fraud to one of constitutional protections and human decency. The lawyer proceeded slowly towards Kody, putting a hand on the shoulder of his client before continuing to speak in court. This man is not a con artist. He is not a criminal genius. He is a husband, a father, and a devout man. He has raised children, constructed a home, and helped in his community. The state would make you believe that he's a threat, because he decided to love more than one woman. But is love illegal? Is faith a felony? The rhetorical questions lingered. Some jurors stirred uncomfortably in their seats, obviously struggling with the enormity of what they were being called upon to determine. The defense lawyer knew that this was his moment. He was not only defending Kody Brown, he was defending the freedom of Americans to live by their sincerely held convictions without prosecution. He looked at the screen that, only yesterday, had been showing the prosecution's incriminating evidence. The state presented you with clips from a reality TV show, edited television designed to be entertaining, not crime evidence. They introduced you to joint financial records, the type any family would have when they live a life together. None of those records indicate that Mr. Brown entered into several legal marriages. None, because he didn't. He held up a single sheet of paper, Kody's marriage certificate to Robyn, the sole legal spouse. This is the one legal marriage sanctioned by the state. All the rest, spiritual commitments, personal vows, ceremonies of faith, they mean everything to the Browns, but they have no legal status in the law. He paused, allowing that to sink in. So if the law only sees one marriage, how can my client be guilty of bigamy? The defense started to systematically tear apart the state's account. They brought in expert witnesses, constitutional law professors, religious freedom experts, and sociologists to describe how plural families such as the Browns had existed for generations, typically in peace, and without state intervention. One professor testified that the U.S. Supreme Court had repeatedly decided that the government was not permitted to criminalize adult consensual private relationships. If these were 5 roommates living together in a house, the state would not be here today, said the professor. But because they share a belief system and refer to themselves as a family, they are now criminals. That is not justice. That is selective enforcement. Then Kody himself testified, for the first time on the stand. The courtroom dropped into a hushed near reverence, as he held up his hand, and vowed to tell the truth. He appeared worn, older than he was, but his voice was steady. I never intended to violate any laws, he answered, his eyes flicking away from the jury and to the judge. I still feel, that the Constitution guarantees my right to live by my religion. I don't have 4 wives under the law. I have 1 wife under the law, and 3 women to whom I am committed spiritually. That's not a crime. That's a vow. A vow I made to them, to my children, and to God. His were words of unvarnished truthfulness that no lawyer could provide. Even the prosecutor who had been so aggressive the previous day was mute when he spoke. Kody discussed how his family always attempted to remain within the limits of the law, how they'd sought to avoid getting multiple marriage licenses, how they'd reported their household status to officials, how they'd never misrepresented their legal status. If loving more than one person is illegal, he said softly, then we're all in trouble, because love doesn't fit neatly into the boxes the government draws. At one point his voice wavered as he spoke about his children. They didn't choose this life. They were born into it. And now, through the way I lived, they must sit in classrooms and learn their father has been called a criminal. That's the worst part of all. The defense attorney stepped back into the well for a compelling closing argument to the day's hearing. He stood holding up the U.S. Constitution, its pages creased and worn by decades of use. This document was drafted to keep the government in check, he stated. It ensures the right to free exercise of religion. It ensures the right to privacy. It ensures that the government can't punish you just for living differently. And yet, here we are, with the state attempting to send a man to prison for simply choosing to love openly and honestly. Then he addressed the jury, his voice more personal. Ask yourselves, were Kody Brown living with 4 women, but referring to them as roommates, would we be here? Was he secretly having relationships and lying about them? Would the state be bothering him? No, they're not prosecuting him for what he did. They're prosecuting him for what he believes. That is not justice. That is persecution. By the time the defense had rested for the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The prosecution's charges of manipulation and deceit were still compelling, but now they were weighed against something equally appealing. The idea that Kody Brown was no villain, but a man entangled in a conflict between law and freedom. Some jurors avoided eye contact with the prosecution team as they filed out, their faces thoughtful and conflicted. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already speculating that the defense had managed to humanize Kody in a way that could sway the outcome. But behind the confident speeches and stirring testimony, Kody knew the fight was far from over. The prosecution still had evidence, and they were certain to return firing with even more severe allegations. But for the first time since the trial had opened, he felt a spark of hope. Perhaps the jury would look beyond the headline-grabbing rubbish and the legalese. Perhaps they would realize that this wasn't about one man defying the law. It was about a question of freedom in America. And as the judge pounded his gavel to adjourn for the night, Kody could not help but give himself the slightest of smiles. The fight was just starting, but for the first time, he felt he could perhaps win the war. The fourth day of the trial opened with a tension so palpable it seemed as though the air itself had mass. The defense had managed to successfully humanize Kody Brown and present the case in a struggle over faith and freedom, but the prosecution was merely getting started. Today, they vowed, would be the day the illusion was broken, the day they drew back the curtain and exposed a lesser-known aspect of the Brown family empire. As the lead prosecutor began to stand, the courtroom collectively paused its breathing. "The defense would have you believe this is about religion," she replied simply, "but today we will demonstrate that it is actually about power." And power here was driven by money. Money that Mr. Brown went out of his way to conceal, manipulate, and transfer in a manner that implies intent to mislead. The initial evidence shown on the courtroom screen was not a marriage certificate or a family picture. It was an Excel spreadsheet full of numbers, transactions, and account information that followed the money trail linking Kody and his wives. "This," the prosecutor declared, "is a snapshot of the finances of the Brown family for 5 years. And as you can see, these are not the finances of one household. This is a coordinated scheme, one that necessitated multiple signatures, multiple accounts, and advanced planning." She highlighted a string of transfers amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars, each one transferring funds from joint accounts into smaller, more difficult-to-trace funds. "Why?" she asked directly to the jury. "Would a man who has nothing to hide organize his finances this way?" Kody squirmed in his seat. He knew that the evidence was incriminating. For years the family had commingled resources, set up accounts in alternate names, and shifted money tactically, not so much to conceal it from the government, but to ensure that each wife was financially independent. But now, under the cold glare of a criminal probe, those tactics didn't seem so clever family planning. They seemed like a scheme. The prosecution presented a forensic accountant to testify, a gray-haired professional who testified in clinical tones. "In my expert opinion," he said, "these financial transactions are evidence of an intentional attempt to hide assets from possible legal ramifications. They're typical of the type of behavior found in tax evasion or fraud cases." The defense quickly objected that the expert was guessing, but the harm was already been done. The jury had heard the words fraud and evasion, and those words carried weight. The prosecutor wasn't finished. She brought up more evidence: property deeds signed jointly by Kody and multiple wives, investment accounts where Christine and Janelle were listed as co-owners, and even a small business registered under Meri's name but funded entirely by Kody. "This is not a man living within the law," she said. "This is a man exploiting the guise of religion to cover up an organized financial system aimed at rewarding himself and protecting himself from responsibility." And then the emails. Dozens of them unearthed from Kody's personal and business accounts, each one rendering the intent clearer. In one, Kody wrote to Janelle, "We should move the funds into a separate account before they start asking questions." In another, he advised Robyn, If anything ever happens, you'll need to claim this as yours. It's safer that way. Each message landed like a blow, stripping away layers of the defense's carefully crafted narrative. Kody wasn't only a man of faith. He was a man preparing for the chance of legal repercussions and moving to protect himself well in advance of the trial. The prosecution wasn't merely concerned about money. They needed to prove that the deception went beyond money. They presented property deeds for Coyote Pass, the large tracts of land Kody had bought for future family residences. He pledged every wife a house of her own, the prosecutor went on. But when marriages started to break down, he slipped some of these plots quietly into Robyn's name, without telling the others. Christine's head jerked up at that announcement, and murmurs passed through the courtroom. For the first time, it was apparent that within the family too, not everybody knew about every money move. This, the prosecutor went on, is not the act of a man of faith. This is the act of someone gathering power, someone ensuring that whatever the outcome, the power and the assets remain in his control. At this point, the atmosphere in the courtroom had turned almost completely around. The defense's initial success at portraying Kody as a victim of government overreach was being taken apart brick by brick. Jurors who had previously nodded sympathetically now sported looks of skepticism and suspicion. Kody's lawyer tried to cross-examine the witnesses, claiming that the transactions were lawful, the conveyance of property within his rights, and the emails out of context. There is no law against relocating your own money, he reminded the jury. There is no crime in keeping for the future. There is no law that prohibits a man from defending his family's property. But his tone was not as strong as it had been once before. The facts were more difficult to dispute than philosophical tenets. The most dramatic time of the day came when Robyn was suddenly summoned to testify. She was white-faced, her hands shaking a little as she was sworn in. The prosecution started off softly but shortly brought the squeeze. "Mrs. Brown," the lawyer asked, "did you know that Kody placed large chunks of property in your name without consulting his other wives?" Robyn hesitated. "I knew about some of it," she confessed. "I trusted him to make those kinds of decisions." "And did he ever speak to you about the potential for legal issues?" The lawyer pushed, tears welled in Robyn's eyes. He told me that we had to be careful. That not everybody would get what we had." The prosecutor nodded again, slower this time. "And did he ever make you assume financial responsibility for assets which were not initially yours?" Robyn's voice caught as she responded. "Yes." The courtroom exploded into gasps, the gravity of her words sinking in. It was the first time one of Kody's wives had ever stated outright that he had made financial moves behind the scenes, and it sliced through the defense's case like a blade. Even Kody's own lawyer seemed taken aback. When Robyn testified, she didn't even meet Kody's eye. The harm was done. As the judge adjourned the day's proceedings, Kody remained seated in silence, his fists clenched in his lap. He had expected the prosecution to try to get into his head, but he hadn't realized how deep they would try to get, or how much they would discover. They'd spun a narrative far darker than he ever could have dreamed. Not a confused husband, but a calculating mastermind of financial fraud. And as the jury began to file out, looking at him with newly cautious eyes, Kody knew that the trial was no longer about whether his plural marriage was legal. It was about whether he had constructed that marriage on a foundation of lies. The fourth day of the trial dawned with an energy that seemed different from anything else. The courtroom was still, but the heavy kind of stillness, the sort that precedes a storm. 3 days of passionate orations, heart-wrenching testimonies, and constitutional debates had prepared the state for a new and more destructive tack. They had already suggested that there were other concerns beyond plural marriage, and now they were ready to expose those concerns. The chief prosecutor, a woman with keen instincts and a reputation for unmasking concealed truths, was standing at her table and addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she started off slowly, "faith is not criminal. But where faith is employed as a cover for malfeasance, where it is used as an alibi to conceal deception, then it is evidence. And that is precisely what we shall demonstrate before you today." The first evidence was not a dramatic photo or a witness, but a simple row of figures on a projected screen. It was a bank statement, one of dozens. "This," the prosecutor said, is the beginning of a financial trail that shows Mr. Brown has not been entirely truthful. The jurors leaned forward as she walked them through transfers, withdrawals, and accounts opened in various names. The amounts weren't small, tens of thousands here, hundreds of thousands there. Money had been shifted between accounts tied to Kody, Meri, Janelle, Christine, and Robyn, sometimes within hours of each other. What we're seeing, the prosecutor explained, is a pattern, one designed to make it difficult for authorities to trace ownership or responsibility. And that's not an accident, that's intent. Kody stared at the floor, his face a mask of stone, but inside he was unraveling. He had always thought that the way they managed their money was clever, even guard-like, a means of keeping each wife safe and finding equilibrium in a complicated home. But now those same choices were being framed as proof of a cover-up. The prosecution called in a forensic financial analyst, who detailed how the accounts were set up. "This is not how most families handle their assets," he declared bluntly. "Those accounts look specially compartmentalized, with money channeled through several hands to hide their point of origin. It implies a deliberate attempt to hide assets from legal recourse." The defense protested, but the judge overruled. The damage was complete. The jurors now had a new prism for considering the case. This was not about faith. It was about manipulation, control, and possibly deception. And the prosecution wasn't finished. Property records were next, demonstrating several deeds in Robyn's name, including those for properties that the other wives had thought they had shared ownership in. Christine, seated behind Kody, winced when a piece of paper showed that a block of land she had once referred to as "our future home" was deeded over entirely to Robyn months prior to the start of the trial. The prosecutor indicated the documents. "Mr. Brown describes these women as equals, that their marriages are spiritual and non-hierarchical. And yet, when it comes to property, when it comes to power, it all seems to wind up under one name." The courtroom hummed with whispers. Even those who had felt sympathetic to Kody were starting to see the fissures in the portrait he painted. Then came a series of internal emails and text messages obtained through discovery.undefined. In one, Kody wrote to Janelle, "If they ever come after us, we'll be prepared. Undefined, move the funds now, and don't mention it to anyone." In another, he told Robyn, "Everything needs to go through you from now on. Undefined. It quotes safes for that way." Each message was like a brick added to a growing wall of suspicion. It was no longer a question of how Kody lived, it was a question of why he had built his life the way he did. When the prosecution asked Robyn to testify, the mood in the room changed once more. She made her way slowly to the witness stand, her gaze on the floor. She was always Kody's biggest supporter, the one who stood up for him publicly and privately. But sworn in and with the threat of perjury, her support crumbled. "Mrs. Brown," the prosecutor started softly, "did Mr. Brown ever speak about placing property in your name to shield it?" Robyn hesitated. "Yes," she whispered. "He told me it was for the family's safety." "And did he ever ask you to transfer money or sign things without sharing it with the other wives?" Another hesitation. "Yes," the prosecutor leaned in. "Why?" Robyn's voice cracked. He told me it was safer if some things were just between us. That it was safer if the others didn't know everything." The gallery was filled with murmurs. Christine buried her face. Meri sat stiffly in front of her, jaw clenched. Even Janelle, who had long boasted of knowing Kody's financial arrangements, wore a shocked expression. The image of togetherness that had kept the Brown family united for generations was disintegrating, not in the eyes of the public, but under the oath of testimony from within. Kody would not meet Robyn's gaze as she left the stand, crying openly. The defense attempted to counter, claiming none of the deals were against the law, and that real estate exchanges were a norm among families. "It is not a crime to move money. It is not a crime to plan for the future. It is not a crime to trust one's spouse," insisted Kody's attorney. "The state is attempting to make financial frugality criminal activity." But the jury had already heard far too much. All explanations now constituted excuses. The evidence of the prosecution wasn't about figures or paperwork. It was about intent. And intent, when it comes to the courtroom, is paramount. The high point of the day came when the prosecutor went back to her bottom line. "The defense would like you to think that Mr. Brown is a man of faith," she said, moving slowly before the jury. But faith doesn't move money through shell accounts. Faith doesn't conceal property transfers from relatives. Faith doesn't instruct one wife to keep secrets from the rest. What we see here is not a man living by his beliefs. What we witness is an individual taking advantage of such beliefs in order to protect himself from repercussions. The environment by the time the recess had been called by the judge was entirely different from the morning of the day. The court no longer observed Kody Brown as just a husband who was struggling for religious freedom. They saw a man indicted for manipulation. A man who might have used religion as a disguise to cover up his wealth, power, and influence. Journalists outside the courthouse described it as a turning point. Lawyers dissected whether the prosecution had just won over the trust of the jury. And within the Brown family, silent cracks widened. As Kody exited the courtroom flanked by cameras and yelled questions, he began to feel the gravity of a new reality bearing down. This trial was no longer about plural marriage alone. It was about all that he had constructed. His family, his money, his reputation, and if it had all been constructed upon a deceitful foundation. And for the first time he understood that the greatest danger to his future could be not the state, but the truth. The fifth day of trial opened with a silence that was heavier than normal. The prosecution's bombshell of the previous day, the money transfers, the clandestine property transactions, and Robyn's tearful testimony, had shaken them all. The press dubbed it the moment the Brown case cracked wide open, and reporters, activists, and curious onlookers flooded into the courthouse to hear what was going to happen next. Today's hearing, however, held out the promise of something even more incendiary. The wives themselves were going to testify. One at a time, the women who had lived with Kody Brown, who had loved him, followed him, trusted him, would be sworn in to give their version of events under oath. And no one, not even Kody, had any idea what they were going to say. The first to testify was Meri, the first wife, the one who had been with Kody the longest. Wearing modestly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, she appeared nervous and tired. "Mrs. Brown," the prosecutor started, "can you tell the court why you agreed to go into a plural marriage?" Meri breathed deeply. "It was our faith," she said quietly. I felt that this was the way God wanted us to live. It wasn't about money or power. It was all about the family." Her tone was serious, but in cross-examination it changed. "Did you ever feel like an equal member of this family?" the prosecutor pressed. Meri paused. "At first, yes," she said. "But with time things changed. Decisions were taken without me. I no longer was asked about big decisions. Occasionally I didn't even know about money until afterward." "And did Mr. Brown ever ask you to sign papers or enter into financial transactions you didn't completely understand?" Another pause. "Yes," she said softly. "I trusted him. I didn't ask questions. Perhaps I should have." Then, Janelle, the no-nonsense second wife, practical and business savvy. She walked up to the stand with her usual composure, but there was an edge in her voice when interrogation started. "Brown," the prosecutor announced, "you were responsible for taking care of the family finances, were you not?" Janelle nodded. "Yes, I did most of the budgeting and planning." "And did you know all of the accounts Mr. Brown had access to?" Janelle's lips hardened. "No, I felt I was, but in discovery, I discovered there were statements that I'd never witnessed before." The courtroom murmured. "Did that surprise you?" "It did," she replied. "I felt we were honest with one another, but apparently there were things going on in the background." The prosecutor continued to question her. "Did Mr. Brown ever tell you to hide financial information?" Janelle fidgeted in her seat. "He never actually said those words, but he made it very clear that some things weren't necessary to be shared. I didn't ask him at the time. I believed he was doing the best for us." If Meri's account had been polite disappointment, Janelle's was contained exasperation. But when Christine testified, the atmosphere was transformed. Christine was always the most vocal of the wives. And now, with the heaviness of years of anger bearing down upon her, she did not hold her tongue. "Mrs. Brown," the prosecutor started, "can you describe your experience in this marriage?" Christine sneered. "Where do I even begin?" she exclaimed. "I came into this marriage because I was a believer in our faith. I had believed in the doctrine of plural marriage. But as the years went by, it was apparent that this had nothing to do with religion anymore. It was about domination. Kody dominated the finances, the properties, the decisions, everything. The prosecutor handed her something, a deed to property. Do you know what this is? Yes, Christine replied, her voice constricting. That's the property we were all to share. But later on, I discovered it was transferred to Robyn without my permission. We used to discuss years ago how we would construct houses for each of the wives over there. That dream was killed the day I laid eyes on that piece of paper. Her testimony hit a nerve. Jurors stirred uncomfortably, and lawyers for Kody grew more and more agitated. Christine wasn't merely relating facts. She was establishing a tableau of betrayal. Did Mr. Brown ever talk to you about legal risk? The prosecutor prompted. Yes, Christine answered. He said not to worry, that if anything ever went wrong, he had a plan. He always had a plan, and we believed him because, well, we trusted him. We loved him. Her voice cracked on the last word, and the courtroom fell silent. Christine dabbed at a tear and stared straight at Kody. But trust doesn't mean much when you're being kept in the dark. The final testimony of the day belonged to Robyn, and it was perhaps the most anticipated of all. After her emotional revelations in the previous session, everyone wondered if she would stand by Kody or distance herself even further. Robyn approached the stand with visible hesitation, her eyes darting briefly toward Kody before settling on the floor. Mrs. Brown, the prosecutor continued, you testified already that Mr. Brown instructed you to transfer funds and sign checks. Why did you do that? Robyn gulped hard. I did it because I thought I could trust him. He said it was for the protection of the family. He told them that people wouldn't comprehend our lifestyle, that we would need to prepare in the event that the law came after us. And did you think he was doing anything wrong? Robyn shook her head. No, I never thought of it like that. I thought he was keeping us safe. But now I'm not sure at all. The defense cross-examined both wives, attempting desperately to reinterpret their testimonies. They insisted that trust, faith, and miscommunication were not criminal intent. They pointed out that none of the wives had ever complained about Kody being coercive or fraudulent. But the damage was done. Every woman, in her own fashion, had eroded the perception of a monolithic, faith-based family. What was left was a picture of dysfunction, dishonesty, and deception. A family torn apart, not by external forces but by the deeds of its father. As the day wound down, the tension in the courtroom was electric. Kody sat at the defense table, his face pale and expressionless, as the full weight of what had occurred started to set in. Those wives who had once stood up so resolutely for him were now his strongest witnesses, not for the defense, but for the prosecution. Their testimony bore weight that no legal contention could resist. They were human, living proof of the harm inflicted by his decisions. The judge requested adjournment, and the courtroom gradually emptied out, the atmosphere heavy with whispers and rumor. Reporters were racing to get their stories in. Legal analysts argued over whether the testimony of the wives had put Kody away. And outside, protesters on both sides yelled louder than ever before, their slogans resounding down the courthouse steps. But deep in Kody's mind, there was just one thought, running over and over: the people he loved most had become the very ones who could ruin him. And no matter how hard he tried to tell himself otherwise, deep down inside he knew. Their words could be the reason he never left that courtroom a free man. The sixth day of the trial commenced under uncertainty. The wives' testimonies had left the courtroom stunned, and the defense reeling to regain control. What had begun as a matter of plural marriage and constitutional freedoms now warped into something much uglier. Allegations of secret funds, tainted property, deception, and the deliberate destruction of trust among family members. The prosecutor smelled blood in the water. Their strategy shifted from proving that Kody had broken the law by practicing polygamy to proving that he had orchestrated an elaborate network of deception to shield himself from accountability. And today, they promised, would be the day the real intent behind Kody's actions was laid bare. The prosecutor's opening remarks were brief but brutal. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, addressing the jury directly. You have heard about faith. You've heard of family, but today you hear of fraud. You'll witness proof that Mr. Brown didn't just have a plural lifestyle, He schemed, conducted, and profited from a calculated program in place to take advantage of that lifestyle for money while staying under the radar. This wasn't faith. This was strategy. Her statement brought a chill into the room. Kody remained still, eyes fixed on the table before him, but thoughts whirling. He had always reminded himself that he was doing it to keep his family safe, that every move, every relocation, every signature was in their best interest. Yet those decisions were now being interpreted as offenses. Prosecutors started out by bringing on a new witness, an old financial advisor, who had previously collaborated with Kody on various business deals related to the family. Smooth and unflappable, the advisor recounted how Kody had come to him years ago with a proposal to split some funds away from the family's main accounts. He said it was about privacy. The advisor testified. He didn't want the government or anybody else to know how much money the family was generating from the show and side ventures. The prosecutor put on a sequence of emails between Kody and the advisor, a number of which included phrases such as "we must keep this off the books and move it before it's questioned." The implication was obvious. Kody wasn't keeping his private life private. He was actively concealing assets. Second, the prosecution presented a timeline of asset purchases and transfers dating more than a decade. It indicated a pattern whenever the state publicly announced that it was investigating polygamy or threatened to crack down on enforcement. Kody would transfer assets, either to new accounts, new business entities, or into his wives' names. This was not coincidence. The prosecutor contended. It was preparation. It was foresight. It was deliberate. The jurors read over the timeline intently, and several of them made notes. Even the defense team shifted uncomfortably. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was a vivid picture of a man who had been expecting legal woes long before they came to pass. Next was one of the trial's most dramatic moments: the revelation of a confidential email exchange between Kody and a private lawyer, obtained by subpoena. The exchange involved discussions of how to structure ownership in a manner which would shield the family from seizure if the state ever filed charges. "It's a risk, but one worth taking," read one of Kody's messages. "We have to ensure they can't get their hands on what's ours." The prosecution posited that this was evidence that Kody was aware his actions were bordering on illegality and actively took measures to insulate himself from legal repercussions. The defense protested, invoking attorney-client privilege, but the judge held that there were portions of the correspondence that were admissible because of the content of the discussions. They weren't obtaining advice of law, they were laying out a game plan. The defense attempted to counterattack by bringing in their own witnesses, religious scholars, friends, and members of the community, who all testified that Kody was a devout man who believed very strongly in his religion and never had any intention of violating the law. They testified that he was generous, family-minded, and misunderstood. "He's not a criminal," a family friend testified. "He's a man trying to live his life according to his faith in a society that can't be bothered to understand them." The defense attorney went further with the persecution story. "This is not about money," he countered. "This is about a government that has chosen to punish a man for being different. They are manipulating his behavior to serve an agenda that isn't true." But the prosecution had more to say. They had one last witness, a state financial crimes division investigator. He told the court that the Brown family's financial activity had strong similarities to tax evasion and asset concealment cases. "We usually find this pattern in cases where people are attempting to shield themselves from lawsuits or government action," he said. "Multiple accounts, quick transfers, changing titles to property. These are traditional red flags." He also disclosed that the state now had in mind additional charges outside of bigamy: tax fraud charges, wire transfer charges, and even conspiracy charges. Gasps ran through the courtroom. For the first time, it was evident that this case may not wind up with a straightforward ruling on polygamy. It could spin out of control into an enormously bigger legal fight with much more serious repercussions. Kody turned pale in the face as the prosecutor outlined the stakes in her day's closing argument. "This is not anymore about how many wives Mr. Brown has," she said, speaking calmly but with a cutting edge. "This is about how far he was willing to go to protect himself, how many laws he was willing to bend, how many people he was willing to deceive, how much money he was willing to move. all to shield himself from accountability. Undefined. He says this is about faith. But the faith requires no offshore accounts. Faith requires no secret property transfers. Faith does not require clandestine discussions about evading the law. By the time the judge declared recess, the courtroom had been silent as a held breath. The prosecution had done more than tighten its case. It had altered the course of the trial at its very foundation. What was once a controversy over religious freedom was now taking the form of a financial crime inquiry. Undefined reporters scrambled to get stories filed with titles such as Kody Brown faces new allegations and from polygamy to fraud. The case expands. TV legal commentators surmised that the state would seek additional indictments, no matter what happened in the trial. As Kody left the courtroom surrounded by a sea of flashing cameras and shouted questions, his mind was a whirlwind of fear and defiance. Undefined. He had started this trial believing he was fighting for his family's right to live freely. Undefined, now. He was fighting for something far more personal. His freedom itself. Undefined. The thought of prison, once unthinkable, now loomed like a shadow over everything. And as he looked back over his shoulder at the disappearing courtroom doors, one chilling realization sank into his belly. This was no trial anymore. Undefined. This was a reckoning. Undefined. And far from finished.